I should have known something was wrong when my sister Rebecca showed up at our mother's funeral, because she was only here to steal my share of the inheritance. For 8 years, I sacrificed everything to care for our mother with dementia, while Rebecca lived her perfect life in Los Angeles. But what I discovered next would expose a web of lies, so shocking it would involve a federal crime. But before I tell my story, please click the subscribe button. I know it may be just a click for you, but for us, it's the fuel that keeps us searching for and bringing you these incredible stories. I should have known something was wrong when my sister Rebecca showed up to our mother's funeral wearing a Chanel suit that cost more than my annual salary as a home health aide. She waltzed into the chapel like she owned the place, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with an arrogance that made my stomach turn. For 8 years, I had been the one holding Mom's hand through every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, every moment of confusion when the dementia stole pieces of her away. Rebecca? She sent Christmas cards from Los Angeles and called maybe twice a year, always too busy with her important marketing executive life to visit Portland. Now here she was, playing the grieving daughter in front of everyone who actually knew the truth. Her crocodile tears didn't fool me for a second, but apparently they fooled everyone else. I watched her accept condolences from neighbors who whispered about what a devoted daughter she was, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Little did I know this performance was just the beginning of the most devastating week of my life. The service was everything Mom would have hated, flashy, expensive, and completely orchestrated by Rebecca without consulting me once. She had hired some fancy funeral director from downtown Portland who kept calling our mother, the deceased, like she was just another case number. I wanted to scream that this was Margaret Thompson, the woman who worked 3 jobs to put food on our table after Dad died when I was 12. She was the woman who taught Sunday school for 30 years and knew every neighbor's name on Elm Street. But Rebecca had taken over all the arrangements the moment she flew in from LAX, dismissing my input like I was some incompetent child who couldn't handle adult responsibilities. I sat in the front pew, wearing my only black dress, a simple one from Target that I'd bought for job interviews, while Rebecca delivered a eulogy that sounded like it came from a stranger. She talked about Mom's legacy and impact, but never mentioned the woman who made sure I did my homework every night or who taught me to change a tire in our driveway. As I listened to her lies, I realized I was grieving 2 losses that day, my mother and any hope I'd had that my sister might actually care about her family. After the burial, people gathered at Mom's house, the Victorian home on Elm Street where Rebecca and I had grown up, where I'd spent the last 8 years caring for Mom through her decline. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting casseroles and condolences while Rebecca held court in the living room, regaling Mom's friends with stories about her successful career in Los Angeles. I escaped to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe, when I overheard Mrs. Patterson from next door talking to her daughter. "Poor Emily," she whispered, sacrificed her whole life for Margaret. Never married, never had kids of her own. I hope Margaret remembered that in her will. Those words hit me like a physical blow because suddenly I realized I had no idea what was in Mom's will. We'd never discussed it directly. Mom always got uncomfortable when I brought up morbid topics, but I'd assumed that since I'd been the one caring for her, since I'd given up my nursing career to be her full-time caregiver, she would have made sure I was taken care of. Standing in that kitchen, surrounded by sympathy casseroles and the smell of Mom's favorite lavender candles, I felt the first flutter of real fear in my chest. The next morning, Rebecca suggested we meet at Stumptown Coffee on Division Street to discuss Mom's affairs, and I naively thought she meant we'd be grieving together, maybe sharing memories and figuring out how to handle the house and Mom's belongings. Instead, she showed up with a leather briefcase and the cold efficiency of a corporate shark, ordering her usual oat milk latte while I nursed a regular coffee I couldn't really afford. "Emily," she said, sliding a thick envelope across the table, "I know this might be difficult, but we need to go over Mom's will." The way she said it, like she was doing me some kind of favor, should have been my first red flag. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, scanning the legal documents that might as well have been written in ancient Greek, for all I could understand. But one thing was crystal clear. According to this will, dated just 6 months ago, Rebecca inherited everything. The house worth over $1 million in Portland's hot real estate market, Mom's investment portfolio, her jewelry, even her car. I was left with a token bequest of $15,000 and a note about being grateful for Emily's companionship in Margaret's final years. "There must be some mistake," I whispered, reading the document again and again, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Rebecca leaned back in her chair with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, stirring her latte with the kind of calculated patience that made my skin crawl. "No mistake, Em. Mom had a lot of time to think these last few months, especially after you started working those extra cleaning jobs and weren't around as much." The accusation hit like a slap. I had taken those jobs because Mom's medical expenses had drained my savings, because someone had to pay for her medications and the special food she needed. "She told me she was worried about your stability," Rebecca continued, each word carefully chosen to wound. "Living paycheck to paycheck at 40. No real career, no family of your own. She didn't want to burden you with the responsibility of managing assets." I stared at my sister's perfectly manicured nails as she delivered this character assassination, remembering how those same hands had never changed Mom's sheets, never held her during a panic attack, never researched dementia care facilities at 3 a.m. "Besides," Rebecca added with a shrug, "you always were the family screw-up." Mom finally saw that. The words "family screw-up" echoed in my head as I stumbled out of that coffee shop, leaving Rebecca to finish her latte while I tried to process what had just happened. I drove Mom's old Honda Civic, apparently one of the few things I was allowed to keep, through the familiar streets of Portland, past the elementary school where Mom had volunteered, past the grocery store where she'd known every cashier's name. Everything looked the same, but my entire world had shifted on its axis in the span of 20 minutes. I pulled into the driveway of the house on Elm Street, the house where I'd lived for the past 8 years, where I'd rearranged my entire life around Mom's needs and schedule. The key still worked in the front door, but somehow it felt like I was trespassing in my own home. I sat on Mom's favorite chair, the recliner where we'd watched countless episodes of Jeopardy together, and tried to make sense of how the woman who used to call me her little angel could have written me out of her life so completely. The house felt different somehow, like it already knew it belonged to someone else, someone who saw it as an investment rather than a home filled with 40 years of memories. That night, as I lay in my childhood bedroom trying to sleep, I kept thinking about something Mrs. Patterson had said. I hope Margaret remembered that in her will. The woman who had lived next door for 30 years seemed genuinely surprised that I might not be taken care of, which suggested that Mom had never indicated any such change of heart to her friends and neighbors. I thought about the last coherent conversation I'd had with Mom, just 2 weeks before her stroke, when she'd squeezed my hand and said, honey, I don't know what I would have done without you." Those didn't sound like the words of someone who thought I was a burden or a screw-up. Something wasn't right about this whole situation, and as I stared at the ceiling where I'd once hung glow-in-the-dark stars as a kid, I made a promise to myself and to Mom's memory. I was going to find out the truth, even if it destroyed what was left of my relationship with Rebecca, because somewhere in my gut, beneath all the shock and pain and humiliation, I knew my mother, the real Margaret Thompson who raised me, would never have left me with nothing. 3 days later, I would discover just how right I was, and Rebecca would learn that underestimating the family screw-up was the biggest mistake of her life. Rebecca gave me exactly 48 hours to get out of the house where I was born, delivered in the very bedroom where Mom had spent her final months. She showed up Tuesday morning with a moving company. Not just any moving company, but some high-end outfit from Lake Oswego with a truck that probably cost more than most people's cars. "I need to start the estate sale process," she announced, standing in our foyer like she was inspecting a property she was thinking of buying. "The realtor says the house will show better empty, and frankly, Emily, your lifestyle choices have really let the place deteriorate." I looked around at the home I'd spent 8 years maintaining, cleaning, and preserving exactly as Mom would have wanted, and saw nothing but love in every corner. But through Rebecca's eyes, I suppose my bargain bin furniture and thrift store finds looked shabby next to her designer tastes. She handed me a business card for a storage facility out in Gresham and told me I could keep personal items and mementos, as if 40 years of my life could be condensed into a 10 by 10 storage unit. Oh, and Em, she added with that poisonous smile, I'll need Mom's car back by Friday. It's part of the estate, and I'm having it detailed before I sell it. The moving men worked with ruthless efficiency, boxing up Mom's lifetime of memories like they were just another job, which I suppose they were. I watched strangers handle Mom's china cabinet, the one she'd saved for years to buy after Dad died, wrapping each piece in newspaper before loading it into boxes labeled Kitchen Fragile. Rebecca supervised from the living room, making phone calls about appraisers and estate sales while I tried to salvage what I could of our family's history. Every time I reached for something that held meaning, Mom's recipe box, the photo album she'd meticulously maintained, the ceramic angel collection she'd started when I was born, one of the movers would politely but firmly redirect me to my personal items pile. Ma'am, we have specific instructions about what goes where, the crew chief explained when I tried to save Mom's sewing machine, the one she'd taught me to use when I was 10. I wanted to scream that I wasn't just ma'am. I was the daughter who had lived in this house, who had earned the right to these memories through 8 years of sacrifice. But Rebecca held all the legal cards, and I was just an obstacle to be moved out of the way. By Wednesday afternoon, my entire life had been reduced to 6 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases that fit in the back of Mom's Honda Civic, the car I'd driven to every one of her doctor's appointments, the car that still smelled faintly of her lavender hand lotion. I sat in the driver's seat in our driveway, watching the movers load the last of Mom's furniture, while neighbors gathered on their porches like spectators at a tragic theater performance. Mrs. Patterson came over with tears in her eyes, pressing casserole into my hands and whispering, "This isn't right, honey." Your mother would be heartbroken. But what could she do? What could any of them do? Rebecca had the law on her side, and I had nothing but a heart full of rage and a bank account with $347.82 in it. I drove away from Elm Street for what I thought would be the last time, glancing in the rearview mirror at the house where I'd taken my first steps, where Mom had read me bedtime stories, where I'd held her hand as she took her last breath. The for sale sign was already being installed on the front lawn, and I realized Rebecca had probably contacted the realtor before she'd even told me about the will. The Motel 6 off I-84 in Gresham became my new reality, a $59 a night reminder of how far I'd fallen in less than a week. The room smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, with paper-thin walls that let me hear every conversation, every argument, every sob story from the other people who'd ended up there through their own series of life disasters. I spread Mom's favorite quilt, one of the few personal items I've been allowed to take, over the scratchy polyester bedspread and tried to make the space feel less like a tomb. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now living in the kind of place Mom and I used to drive past when I was a kid, when she'd squeeze my hand and say, "See, Em? That's why we work hard and stay grateful for what we have." I'd thrown away my nursing career to care for her, thinking I was making a noble sacrifice, thinking I was building something meaningful with our time together. Now I was 40 years old with an 8-year gap in my resume, no references except the home health agency that had let me go when I couldn't work regular shifts anymore, and a sister who'd made it clear she considered me a charity case. Finding work turned out to be even more humiliating than I'd expected, especially when I had to explain why a former registered nurse was applying for minimum wage cleaning jobs. "You're overqualified," they'd say, or "We're looking for someone more committed to this type of work," which was corporate speak for, "You'll leave the moment something better comes along." But I couldn't afford to be picky, so I swallowed my pride and took whatever I could get. Office buildings at night, wealthy neighborhoods in West Hills where women my age wouldn't make eye contact as I scrubbed their toilets and vacuumed their Persian rugs. The worst part wasn't the work itself. I'd been cleaning for Mom for years, and honest work never bothered me. The worst part was the pity in people's voices when they asked about my situation, the way they'd leave extra tips like I was some tragic figure they could feel good about helping. One client, a woman about my age with perfectly highlighted hair and a kitchen that cost more than most people's annual salaries, actually asked if I needed resources for getting back on my feet, handing me a pamphlet for job training programs like I was some high school dropout who'd never learned marketable skills. But it was while cleaning that same woman's house in West Hills that I got the call that would change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer because debt collectors had started calling about Mom's final medical bills. Emily Thompson. The voice was elderly, shaky, but somehow familiar. This is Charles Mitchell. I was your mother's attorney for 23 years. My blood went cold because Rebecca had told me that Mom's attorney had retired and moved to Arizona, which was why she'd had to find a new lawyer for the recent will. I had just heard about Margaret's passing from my old secretary, and I wanted to express my condolences. Also, I'm a bit confused about something. I have Margaret's will here in my office safe, dated 2019. According to my records, it was never revoked or updated. The woman whose house I was cleaning looked annoyed that I'd answer my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to care about her disapproval. Charles Mitchell was telling me that there might be another will, the real will, and that Rebecca's version might not be the final word after all. That night, I sat in my Honda Civic in the Motel 6 parking lot, the engine running for heat, while I tried to process what Charles Mitchell had told me. He wanted to meet first thing Monday morning, and something in his voice suggested he was as troubled by this situation as I was. I thought about calling Rebecca, confronting her with this new information, but some instinct told me to wait, to be smart about this for once instead of just reacting with my heart. Through the windshield, I could see other people in similar circumstances, a woman about my age loading laundry into her car, a man counting change for the vending machine. All of us just trying to survive whatever catastrophe had landed us here. The difference was I was starting to suspect that my catastrophe wasn't an act of fate. It was an act of fraud. Rebecca had always been the smart one, the successful one, the sister who knew how to work the system to her advantage. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the woman she'd spent our entire lives calling a failure. As I settled in for another night of sleeping in my car because I couldn't afford another night at the motel, I made a promise to Mom's memory and to myself. If Rebecca thought she could steal my mother's legacy and leave me with nothing, she was about to learn that the family screw-up was a lot tougher than she'd ever given me credit for. Charles Mitchell's law office was nothing like the sleek downtown firm where Rebecca had supposedly handled Mom's new will. It was a cramped space above a used bookstore in southeast Portland, filled with decades of case files and the kind of wood paneling that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. But when the elderly lawyer opened his safe and pulled out a manila envelope with Mom's name written in his careful handwriting, my hand started shaking before he even spoke. "Emily," he said, his voice grave behind wire-rimmed glasses that had probably seen 1,000 family tragedies. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Did your mother ever mention wanting to change her will, especially in regards to leaving you out of it?" The question hit me like ice water because the answer was so obviously no. Mom had never said anything remotely suggesting she was disappointed in me or wanted to disinherit me. In fact, our last coherent conversation had been about how grateful she was for my sacrifice, how she knew she'd been a burden but couldn't imagine facing her illness without me. Charles nodded grimly when I told him this, then slid a document across his desk that would turn my world upside down yet again. "This is your mother's actual will," Charles said, watching my face as I read words that made my heart pound so hard I thought it might burst. According to this document, dated 2019 and witnessed by two of Mom's longtime friends, she had left everything to me: the house, the investments, even her jewelry collection that had belonged to my grandmother. There was a small bequest for Rebecca, $25,000 with a note expressing hope that distance and time might eventually heal the rift between my daughters. But the bulk of the estate, worth nearly $2 million according to the attached asset list, was meant to be mine in recognition of Emily's unwavering devotion and the sacrifice of her own dreams to care for me. I read the words over and over, my mother's love and gratitude practically radiating from the legal language, and felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: vindication. This was the mother I knew, the woman who understood what I'd given up and wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of after she was gone. "Mr. Mitchell," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Rebecca showed me a completely different will. How is that possible? Charles Mitchell had been practicing law for 47 years, and I could see the weight of that experience in his eyes as he explained what we were dealing with. Emily, what you're describing sounds like fraud, specifically the fabrication of a legal document for financial gain. It's a felony under Oregon law, and if it involves this kind of money, we're talking about serious federal charges as well. He pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the signatures on both documents, pointing out subtle differences that my untrained eye had missed. See here? The way your mother wrote her M in Margaret. She always made that little flourish at the bottom. And this T in Thompson has a distinctive cross that she'd done the same way for decades. The signature on your sister's document doesn't match these patterns. I felt sick to my stomach as the implication sank in. Rebecca hadn't just lied to me about Mom's final wishes. She committed a crime that could send her to prison. But I also felt something else brewing inside me. A cold, calculating anger that reminded me I wasn't just Margaret Thompson's grieving daughter anymore. I was a woman who'd been systematically destroyed by someone I'd trusted my entire life. We need to get this to the authorities immediately, Charles said, but I found myself asking him to wait, to give me 24 hours to process this information before we involved the police. Something about Rebecca's confidence during our coffee shop confrontation had been bothering me. She'd been too prepared, too smooth, like she'd rehearsed her lines. If she was smart enough to forge a will, she was probably smart enough to have covered her tracks in other ways too. I used my last $50 to hire a private investigator recommended by Charles, a former Portland PD detective named Jake Rodriguez who specialized in financial fraud cases. Look, I told him over coffee at a diner in Burnside, I know Rebecca's hiding something bigger than just a forged will. She was too confident, too prepared. People don't just wake up one day and decide to defraud their siblings. This was planned. Jake listened to my story with the kind of professional attention that made me feel like someone was finally taking me seriously, then quoted me a price that would wipe out what little savings I had left. But I didn't hesitate. I'd been cleaning office buildings and rich people's houses for 2 weeks, and I was going to use every penny I'd earned to expose what Rebecca had done to me and to Mom's memory. Jake's investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Probably because Rebecca had been sloppy in ways that suggested she'd never imagined anyone would question her story. Within 3 days, he discovered that the law firm Rebecca claimed had handled Mom's new will didn't exist. The address she'd given me led to a vacant office space that had been empty for 6 months. The attorney whose name was on the documents had been disbarred 2 years ago for financial misconduct, and a phone call to his last known address revealed he'd moved to Mexico and wasn't taking calls from American investigators. Emily, Jake said when he called with his preliminary findings, your sister didn't just forge your mother's signature. She created an entire fictional legal scenario, complete with fake lawyers and fake witnesses. This is an amateur hour. This is sophisticated fraud that probably took months to plan. I was scrubbing floors at a medical office in Beaverton when I got that call, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to process what he was telling me. Rebecca hadn't just betrayed me in a moment of grief-driven selfishness. She'd been planning this con for months, possibly while I was still caring for Mom, still believing we were a family. The forensic handwriting analysis that Jake arranged through his contacts at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab was the final nail in Rebecca's coffin, though I didn't know it yet. Dr. Sarah Chen, a court-certified forensic document examiner, spent 3 hours comparing Mom's real signature to the one on Rebecca's fake will, using equipment that could analyze everything from pen pressure to the microscopic variations in how someone forms their letters. Ms. Thompson, she said when she called with her results, I can say with absolute certainty that your mother did not sign the document your sister presented. In fact, whoever forged the signature made several rookie mistakes that suggest they practiced the signature but never quite mastered your mother's natural hand movements. She explained that Mom's arthritis had caused her to develop a distinctive tremor in her writing over the past few years, a tremor that was completely absent from the signature on Rebecca's will. This signature was made by someone young, someone whose hands don't shake, someone who was copying your mother's signature rather than writing it naturally. As I listened to Dr. Chen's technical explanation, I realized that Rebecca had just handed me enough evidence to destroy her life the same way she'd tried to destroy mine. That night, I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking lot of a 24-hour Denny's in Gresham. Jake's investigative report spread across my passenger seat, like evidence in a crime drama. The manila folder contained photocopies of Rebecca's fake documents, comparisons to the real will, financial records showing suspicious activity in Mom's accounts during her final months, and a timeline that painted a picture of premeditated fraud spanning nearly a year. According to Jake's research, Rebecca had been systematically preparing for this theft since Mom's diagnosis became more serious, researching inheritance law, studying Mom's signature from old Christmas cards and letters, even visiting Mom more frequently in her final months. Not out of love, but to establish herself as the involved daughter for anyone who might later question her story. I thought about all those times Rebecca had called during Mom's last year, asking detailed questions about Mom's condition, her medications, her lucid moments, questions I'd interpreted as concern, but now realized were intelligence gathering. The sister I'd grown up with, the sister I defended to neighbors who wondered why she never visited, had been planning to rob me blind while I was busy keeping Mom comfortable and safe. Rebecca thought she'd been so clever, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how much evidence a good private investigator could uncover in 72 hours, and tomorrow morning, I was going to show her exactly what it felt like to have your entire world collapse in the span of a single conversation. I called Rebecca and asked to meet her at the same Stumptown Coffee, where she delivered her devastating news just 2 weeks earlier, and something in my voice must have convinced her I wasn't the broken, defeated woman she'd left crying over a latte. She arrived 15 minutes late, probably a power play, wearing another expensive outfit and carrying the same leather briefcase like she was still in control of the situation. But when I slid Jake's investigative report across the table, complete with forensic analysis, financial records, and photographs of the fake law office she'd invented, I watched 35 years of sibling superiority crumble from her face in real time. "What the hell is this?" she demanded. But her voice had lost that confident edge, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like panic. "It's the truth, Rebecca," I said calmly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "It's documentation of every lie you've told, every document you've forged, and every law you've broken while trying to steal our mother's legacy." She flipped through the pages with increasingly pale fingers, and I could practically see her brain working frantically to figure out how much trouble she was actually in. "You hired a private investigator?" she whispered, like the concept of me fighting back had never occurred to her. "You always were smarter than you let people believe. Weren't you, Rebecca?" Rebecca's first instinct was to go on the offensive, which told me everything I needed to know about how guilty she felt. "This is ridiculous, Emily. You're so desperate to play victim that you're willing to waste money you don't have on some half-baked conspiracy theory." But her hands were shaking as she said it, and she kept glancing around the coffee shop like she expected police officers to materialize at any moment. "Mom was losing her mind those last few months. You know that better than anyone. She probably signed dozens of documents she didn't understand. I let her finish her performance before pulling out the forensic handwriting analysis that Dr. Chin had prepared, complete with magnified images showing the differences between Mom's real signature and Rebecca's forgery. "Except Mom didn't sign your will, Rebecca. You did, and you did a pretty terrible job of it, considering you had months to practice." I watched her read Dr. Chen's conclusion, that the signature was definitely fraudulent and made by someone significantly younger than Mom, and saw something die behind her eyes. The mask of righteous indignation slipped away, replaced by the calculating expression of someone trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to herself. "Okay," Rebecca said finally, her voice dropping to a whisper as she leaned across the table. "Let's say you're right about some irregularities. What do you want? You want to split the estate 50-50? I can live with that." The offer confirmed everything I'd suspected. She knew exactly what she'd done and was now trying to negotiate her way out of consequences. But I wasn't the same broken woman who'd sat in this chair 2 weeks ago, begging for scraps from my own mother's estate. "I don't want to split anything, Rebecca. I want what Mom actually left me, which according to her real will is everything except $25,000 that she left you out of love, not obligation. I pulled out Charles Mitchell's copy of the authentic will and watched Rebecca's face go completely white as she read Mom's actual words. Words of gratitude for my sacrifice. Words of hope that distance might heal the rift between her daughters. Words that made it clear who the favorite daughter really was. "This will doesn't exist," Rebecca said desperately. "I had Mom's attorney handle everything. I have documentation." "You mean the attorney who was disbarred 2 years ago? The one who moved to Mexico? The one whose law office has been empty for 6 months?" I asked, enjoying the way each question made her flinch like I was physically hitting her. Rebecca's desperation quickly turned to rage, and for the first time in our adult lives, I saw the real person beneath her polished exterior, someone capable of calculated cruelty in ways I'd never imagined. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Emily. You think you can just waltz in here with some fake documents and destroy my life? I have resources. I have connections. I will bury you in legal fees until you're living on the street where you belong." She pulled out her phone and started making calls right there in the coffee shop, speaking in rapid, urgent tones to what sounded like lawyers and investigators of her own. I sat there calmly sipping my coffee while she tried to mount a counterattack, because Jake had prepared me for exactly this scenario. "She'll try to discredit you," he'd warned. "She'll claim you forged the real will, that you're the one committing fraud. People like Rebecca don't go down without a fight." But I had something Rebecca didn't have, the truth, backed up by forensic evidence and documented by professionals who testified in federal court. More importantly, I had time on my side. While Rebecca had been playing corporate executive in Los Angeles, I'd been here building relationships with Mom's real friends, her real neighbors, people who knew exactly which daughter had been present for the last 8 years. Over the next 3 days, Rebecca unleashed every weapon in her considerable arsenal, hiring a team of lawyers who tried to intimidate Charles Mitchell into retracting his statements and discrediting Jake's investigation. She filed counterclaims alleging that I had somehow manipulated Mom during her illness, that I had forged the 2019 will, that I was the one guilty of elder abuse and fraud. But her attacks were so obviously desperate, so transparently retaliatory, that they actually strengthened my case rather than weakening it. Jake's contacts in law enforcement were already suspicious of Rebecca's story. Forged wills involving this kind of money always triggered federal investigations, and her aggressive legal maneuvering just made her look more guilty. "Emily," Jake called me Thursday afternoon while I was cleaning houses in West Hills. "Rebecca made a huge mistake. She tried to have your mother's bank records sealed, claiming they contained proprietary family information. But that just gave the FBI grounds to subpoena everything under the assumption she's hiding something. I had to sit down on my client's expensive marble countertop as the implications sank in. Rebecca's own attempts to cover her tracks had just opened her financial life to federal scrutiny. The FBI's forensic accountant found irregularities in Mom's finances that went far beyond a simple forged will. Irregularities that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning nearly 2 years. According to the preliminary report that Jake shared with me, Rebecca had been siphoning money from Mom's investment accounts through a series of complex transfers that she disguised as medical expenses and home care costs. The total amount was staggering. Over $300,000 that had been moved from Mom's portfolio into accounts Rebecca controlled. Money that was supposed to pay for Mom's care but had instead funded Rebecca's lifestyle in Los Angeles. "Emily," the FBI agent assigned to the case explained when she called me Friday evening, "your sister wasn't just planning to steal your inheritance. She was already stealing it, bit by bit, counting on your mother's illness to prevent anyone from noticing the discrepancies." I thought about all those times I'd worried about money for Mom's medications, all those cleaning jobs I'd taken to make ends meet, while Rebecca was literally stealing from the woman I was sacrificing everything to care for. The betrayal went so much deeper than I'd imagined. She hadn't just wanted to cheat me out of my inheritance. She'd been stealing from Mom while I was working myself to exhaustion, trying to keep her comfortable. Saturday morning at 6 a.m., I was having coffee in my Honda Civic outside the Motel 6 when Jake called with news that would have sounded like fiction if I hadn't lived through the past 3 weeks myself. Emily, you need to turn on the news. Channel 8 is running a story about your sister. I fumbled for my phone and found the live stream just in time to see Rebecca being let out of her expensive Los Angeles apartment building in handcuffs. A perp walk that was being broadcast on local news stations in both Oregon and California. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, elder abuse, forgery, theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes, federal charges that carried decades in prison if she was convicted. The news anchor mentioned that the case involved nearly $2 million in stolen assets and sophisticated identity fraud targeting an elderly victim with dementia. I watched my sister's neighbors and colleagues gather on the sidewalk, their faces showing the same shock I'd felt when I first learned the truth about her character. Rebecca had built her entire adult life on an image of success and sophistication, and now that image was crumbling on live television while she tried to hide her face from cameras. As I watched her being loaded into a federal vehicle, I realized that her biggest mistake hadn't been underestimating me. It had been overestimating her own intelligence and believing that she could commit crimes this serious without eventually getting caught. Justice was finally coming, and Rebecca was about to learn what it felt like to lose everything that mattered to her, just like she tried to do to me. Watching Rebecca being led away in handcuffs in front of her high-rise apartment building in downtown Los Angeles was satisfying in ways I hadn't expected, but it was nothing compared to the phone call I received 3 hours later from her former colleagues. Emily, this is Patricia Williams from Morrison and Associates. I worked with your sister for 6 years, and I just wanted to say how sorry I am about what she did to you and your family. The woman's voice was shaky, like she was processing her own shock at discovering who Rebecca really was beneath that polished exterior. We had no idea she was capable of this. The partners are meeting this afternoon to discuss her termination, obviously, but I wanted you to know that some of us suspected she was living beyond her means. Designer clothes, expensive vacations, that BMW she drove, none of it added up on a marketing executive salary. I thanked Patricia for calling and hung up feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Validation from people who actually knew Rebecca professionally. The perfect facade she'd maintained for years was crumbling in real time, and everyone who'd believed her lies about being the successful sister was finally seeing the truth. Charles Mitchell called me Monday morning with news that would change my life more dramatically than even I had imagined. Emily, we've completed the forensic audit of your mother's estate, and there are some developments you need to know about. His voice carried an excitement that seemed inappropriate for a man who'd spent 47 years delivering mostly bad news to grieving families. First, all of your mother's assets have been recovered from Rebecca's accounts. She hadn't had time to hide the money as thoroughly as she thought. But more importantly, we've discovered that your mother's house has been designated as a historic landmark by the Portland Historic Preservation Commission. I didn't understand the significance until he explained that historic properties in Portland's Irvington neighborhood had been appreciating at double the normal rate, meaning the house I'd grown up in was now worth nearly $2.8 million instead of the $1.2 million Rebecca had planned to sell it for. Your mother never knew about the historic designation. It was approved just 2 weeks before her death. But Emily, this means your inheritance is worth almost $3 million. Not counting the investment portfolio and other assets Rebecca tried to steal. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected, largely because Rebecca's own arrogance had created an overwhelming paper trail of evidence against her. Her team of expensive lawyers tried every trick in the book, claiming she was protecting Mom from my manipulation, arguing that I had somehow coerced an elderly woman with dementia, even suggesting that I had forged the real will to frame Rebecca after the fact. But the forensic evidence was ironclad, and Rebecca's financial crimes were so extensive that even her own attorney seemed embarrassed by her defense strategy. Emily, the federal prosecutor explained during one of our meetings, your sister didn't just commit fraud, she committed stupid fraud. She left digital footprints everywhere, used her real name on fake documents, and apparently never considered that someone might actually investigate her story. The preliminary hearing lasted only 3 hours before Rebecca's lawyers advised her to accept a plea deal. 15 years in federal prison for elder abuse, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges, plus full restitution of all stolen funds and forfeiture of her Los Angeles apartment to pay legal fees and penalties. Standing in the courtroom when Rebecca formally accepted her plea deal was one of the most surreal moments of my life. Watching the sister who'd called me a family screw-up admit to crimes that would define the rest of her existence. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with the orange jumpsuit she was wearing. And when the judge asked if she had anything to say to her victims, she turned to look at me with something that might have been remorse or might have been calculation. With Rebecca, it was impossible to tell the difference. "I'm sorry, Emily," she said, her voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "I never meant for it to go this far." But her apology felt hollow because we both knew she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry for getting caught, sorry for underestimating the failure sister who'd managed to unravel her entire criminal enterprise. The judge wasn't impressed either, noting that Rebecca's crimes showed a level of premeditation and callousness that suggests a fundamental lack of empathy for her own family members. As they led her away to begin her 15-year sentence, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or revenge, but a profound sadness for the sister I'd lost long before I ever knew she was stealing from us. Returning to Mom's house on Elm Street for the first time as its legal owner was an emotional experience that nearly brought me to my knees. But this time the tears were tears of homecoming rather than grief. Charles Mitchell handed me the keys with a smile that suggested he'd seen enough injustice in his career to genuinely appreciate moments when the good guys actually won. "Your mother would be proud, Emily, not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've handled yourself through this entire ordeal." I walked through the rooms where I'd spent 40 years of my life, where I'd cared for Mom during her final years, where Rebecca had tried to erase my existence just weeks earlier. Everything looked the same, but felt completely different. This wasn't the house I was being evicted from anymore. It was the home Mom had wanted me to have, the legacy she'd left to ensure I'd be taken care of after sacrificing so much to take care of her. I stood in Mom's bedroom, touching the windowsill where she used to sit and watch the neighborhood children walk to school, and made a decision that would honor both her memory and my own transformation from victim to survivor. The Margaret Thompson Center for Family Alzheimer's Support opened 18 months later in the renovated house on Elm Street. Funded by the inheritance Rebecca had tried to steal and designed to help other families navigate the challenges I'd faced during Mom's illness. We kept the Victorian architecture intact, but added wheelchair accessibility, support group meeting rooms, and a library of resources for caregivers who were struggling with the same impossible choices I'd made 8 years earlier. "Emily," said Dr. Patricia Chin, the geriatrician who served on our board of directors, "your mother's legacy is going to help hundreds of families avoid the isolation and financial hardship that you experienced." The center offered everything I wished had existed during Mom's decline. Respite care for exhausted family members, financial planning for long-term care costs, support groups for siblings dealing with unequal caregiving responsibilities, and legal resources to prevent the kind of elder abuse Rebecca had perpetrated. Mrs. Patterson, now 82 herself, volunteered as a receptionist and loved telling visitors about how Emily turned her tragedy into triumph for everyone. On busy days, when the house was full of families learning how to care for their loved ones with dignity, I could almost feel Mom's presence in the rooms where we'd struggled together through her final years. 2 years after Rebecca's sentencing, I received a letter from her at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, where she was serving her 15-year sentence. She'd been assigned to work in the prison library and had apparently used her time to research elder abuse cases, discovering just how common financial exploitation of vulnerable seniors actually was. "Emily," she wrote, "I know my apology means nothing after what I put you through, but I want you to know that I understand now what I stole from you. Not just money, but your sense of family, your trust, your security during the hardest time of your life." The letter was 3 pages of what seemed like genuine remorse, but I filed it away without responding because some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, no matter how much time passes or how much justice is eventually served. Today, When I drive past the house on Elm Street and see families coming and going from the Margaret Thompson Center, when I see caregivers finding support and resources that didn't exist when I needed them, I know that Mom's real legacy isn't the money she left me or even the justice we achieved against Rebecca. Her real legacy is the transformation of our family's tragedy into something that helps other families avoid the isolation and exploitation we experienced. Rebecca thought she was so smart, manipulating an elderly woman with dementia and intimidating the sister she'd always considered a failure. But in the end, the family screw-up not only exposed her crimes and reclaimed our mother's legacy. I turned that legacy into something that will protect vulnerable families for generations to come, ensuring that Rebecca's 15 years in prison will be followed by a lifetime of knowing that her victim became stronger than she ever was.